Welcome back to Environmental Ethics. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing ethical egoism. So ethical egoism is the view that our ultimate sense of moral obligation rests on self-interest. In other words, it is the idea that what we ought to do is pursue our own self-interest. Right, so it's somewhat of an endorsement of selfishness, but as we see in the reading, there are lots of different ways to think about ethical egoism. This reading by James Rachel covering ethical egoism comes right before the main three ethical theories that we will discuss. And the reason why we talk about this is because it's closely related to a main issue in environmental ethics, which is anthropocentrism. So, one hurdle or obstacle to having an environmental ethic or understanding ourselves as having ethical obligations to nature itself in some way is anthropocentrism. So anthropocentrism means human-centered. And usually an anthropocentric view is one that prioritizes human interests, needs, wants, ambition. If most ethical theories are anthropocentric, right? The ones that we will read for sure are. And they're concerned with our obligations, what humans' obligations are to other human beings, right? And to ourselves. And so it very much is focused on the conduct of human beings and not really concerned with nature. One challenge, one might think, to an environmental ethic is to see how we can move away from an anthropocentric ethic and get one that's different, right? So we'll consider biocentric views, which are life-centered views, but you can also have various different kinds of anti-anthropocentric sentiments, right? And so the ultimate kind of anthropocentrism would be something like ethical egoism, where it's just it's very self-centered, right? So that's why we talk about this at this point, and it helps us understand the intricacies of what it means to pursue one's self-interest. So one thing to start off with when talking about ethical egoism is to differentiate it from psychological egoism, right? So ethical egoism is an ethical position. It tells us what we ought to do. Psychological egoism is the idea that people do pursue their self-interest, right? That's different. So psychological egoism is basically the claim that people are intrinsically or naturally selfish or something like this. Ethical egoism is different because it says that we should be selfish or we should pursue our self-interest. It's a value claim about what we ought to do. In Rachel's article, he considers three arguments in favor of ethical egoism. And as it turns out, Rachel's is not very friendly towards ethical egoism. He's really setting this up in order to kind of shoot down all these possible positions. The first position is what I call the oxygen mask argument, right? He does not call it this, but basically, when the reason why I call it the oxygen mask argument is because if you're ever riding in a plane with a small child, they always stop by and say, be sure to secure your oxygen mask before securing your child, right? And why is that? Well, because if you get caught up and try to help out the child before securing your own mask, you might pass out in the process, and then you can't help the child, right? So the idea is, even though it's not intuitive, you secure your own mask first, so that way you're in a position to be helpful to the child, right? And so this kind of argument for ethical egoism is the idea that we should be selfish or pursue our self-interest because it better places us in a position to be helpful to others, right? Rachel's takes issue with this because he thinks it's really not ethical egoism, right? Ultimately, what this position is what we'll know as ethics of altruism. The real standard that determines what we ought to do is pursuing the interests of others, right? Being helpful to others. Altruism is the idea of doing something good without expecting anything in return, right? And so this oxygen mask argument is not really an argument for ethical egoism. It's just basically saying that self-interest is okay to pursue as long as you are ultimately in the pursuit of helping others. The second argument that he considers is one by Ayn Rand. Now, Ayn Rand is a famous author who is very unapologetic about her endorsement of selfishness and the pursuit of self-interest. Ayn Rand basically makes the claim that ethics of altruism, always putting people's needs before your own, leads to a really kind of problematic and kind of self-deprecating kind of position where you're never concerned with your own interests, right? If you're always concerned about the greater good or the good of other people, then you kind of lose your sense of individuality. And so she thinks because ethics of altruism kind of foregoes this development of the individual, we should abandon it, and so ethical egoism is the better alternative. The third argument that he considers in favor of ethical egoism is that ethical egoism can be seen as a basis for common sense morality, right? Now, one thing to think about when it comes to ethical egoism is that there's a difference between what you think is in your self-interest and what is in your self-interest, right? So maybe what you think is in your self-interest short-term might actually conflict with what is actually in your self-interest long-term. So, for example, you want to go party a lot, and so you drink a lot and all this kind of stuff, and it makes you feel good in the moment, but over time, this is actually having a negative impact on your life and you're suffering consequences that you don't want to have to deal with. So the idea for ethical egoism as a basis for common sense morality is that if you really think about what's in your self-interest, you'll start to act according to kind of common sense rules. You won't steal from other people because you don't want to get caught, and you also don't want them to steal from you. And you won't lie to other people because you don't want to get caught, and you don't want to have to perpetuate a lie, and you want people to be honest with you, and it creates a better platform for communication. You'll start to help other people because they tend to see you in a better light and help you out in return, and so on and so forth. And so you start to think about all these basic rules that we have, and you start to see that they align with your self-interest. Rachel's has arguments against all of these, right? The first one, in terms of the oxygen mask argument, Rachel's thinks that the oxygen mask argument is not really ethical egoism. For Ayn Rand, he thinks that she's kind of giving us two extreme alternatives: ethical egoism in a very extreme sense and ethics of altruism in a very extreme reading, and she's kind of forcing us to pick between the two. And for the third argument, he thinks that although ethical egoism could be a basis for common sense morality, it doesn't have to be, and it's not clear that it is the basis for common sense morality, and it can also part ways with common sense morality. So you might start to see that maybe stealing on occasion is in your best interest and not in the interests of others, especially if you don't get caught, this kind of thing. So they can come apart. Rachel also considers some arguments against ethical egoism, and the main thing that he really focuses on is this idea that we are prioritize our own interests, right? And this seems to be the cause of a lot of problems that he sees. So one has to do with conflicts of interest. So according to ethical egoism, I should prioritize my self-interest. And according to ethical egoism, you should prioritize your self-interest. And so what do we do when there's conflicts of interest? It seems like this one and the same moral theory is kind of promoting this conflict of interest and not resolving it. The second one is that it seems to be logically inconsistent along the same lines, because if it seems in my interest to steal from you and it seems against your self-interest for me to steal from you, it seems like ethical egoism is telling us that stealing is both wrong and not wrong at the same time. And the third point is that ethical egoism, he thinks, is arbitrary in the sense that it's arbitrarily prioritizing my self-interest, right? So ethical egoism tells me that I ought to pursue my self-interest, but everyone has interest, and so why not prioritize my brother's self-interest? Why not prioritize my kids' self-interest? There's lots and lots of people with lots of interests, so based on what do I promote my own self-interest over the interests of others? And so he thinks all of these kind of lead to this kind of problem with ethical egoism, and so he's not very friendly towards the idea of ethical egoism. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.